It seems like every major event in American history, from war to disasters, they all have a ghost story or two attached to them.
How big of a role has the paranormal played in American society?
It's a lot bigger than most people think, its role in American history. Going back to like when the first settlers came to New England, I mean, they brought with them their fear of witchcraft, for instance, which would lead to all of the witch trials and to all of the events in places like Salem. And then in the 19th century, you talk about the spiritualist movement, which was something that was created with the idea that the dead and the living could communicate with each other, that there would be messages sent to the dead that would be returned. And, you know, that started in the late 1840s and it became a national fad. I mean, it was at a time when the population in the United States was at about 10 million people, and it was estimated that 3 million of them were spiritualists, having seances and talking to ghosts, and resurgence in it, interest in it took off again after the Civil War. It would happen again after World War I, not just in America, but around the world, because, you know, no one had ever seen this kind of death before, you know, the numbers of people that died. The first seances in the White House took place when Jane Pierce was there. Her husband was Franklin Pierce, and their son died in a train accident on their way to Washington for his inauguration. And she actually was so heartbroken, she had spiritualists in the White House doing seances. Mary Lincoln would do the same thing later when her son Willie died in the White House, died of a disease. And there are diaries and letters from spiritualists that still exist that say that not only was Mary involved in the seances, but so was her husband, Abraham Lincoln, as well. The first person that ever ran for president, or first woman to run for president, was a woman named Victoria Woodhull, who did not do well. She couldn't even vote for herself at that point in history, but she was a spiritualist medium. My favorite president, as far as ghosts go, American history, Harry Truman, who was absolutely convinced that the White House was haunted. He used to send letters home to his wife all the time, talking about how he would hear footsteps in the hallways and people knocking on his door. And during the time he was in the White House, they did a big renovation, so he had to move across the street for a bit. And when they were getting ready to reopen the White House, he actually took a big group of reporters on a tour to show them the work that had been done. And when they published their articles the next day, most of the stories that were in it weren't about the White House. They were about all the ghosts in the White House and how President Truman couldn't wait to get back so he could start ghost hunting again. I'm not making this up. It's all true. So it seems like every major event in American history, from war to disasters, they all have a ghost story or two attached to them.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think, what is it, something uniquely American about us that we gravitate towards this?
You know, I always like to say that America is a nation of extremes. We've always been that way. You can date that back to the very beginning, and why people came here in the first place is because there were a lot of extremist religious groups in Europe that came here looking for freedom, and they just kind of brought that stuff with them. We really go to extremes, so when we jump into something and we're fascinated by it, we'll take it all the way. And I think that the supernatural has been one of those things. Americans just love ghost stories. I think that ghosts also appeal to us in another way, too, more than any other type of the supernatural, because ghosts, kind of the same way that spiritualism did back, you know, in the 19th century, it gives us a little bit of hope. Even if we don't dwell on that aspect of it, we're really looking at what's scary about it most of the time. We love to be scared, but deep down, we have this idea that if ghosts are real, if they're real, if these things really happen, then that means there's something after this.
When we look at kind of the paranormal history of the United States, does it gravitate in a certain direction? Like, people have always really gone to ghosts, or they've gone to psychics, or does it seem to have a direction overall?
Honestly, I think it varies. I mean, it varies by time period. A lot of it depends on what's going on in current events as to what we gravitate toward, whether it's ghost stories or whether it's psychic mediums or, reincarnation or you name it. I mean, we've had it all. But I think a lot of it has to do with what's happening. It can be, a historical or a political thing. It could be a war. It could be, some kind of conflict. You see interest go up in the supernatural. It also depends on what's happening in pop culture too. Like in the 80s and 90s when Ghostbusters and the X-Files were hot stuff, everybody was into ghosts and UFOs and anything paranormal. And then later it would be like reality TV ghost things, with the guys on TV running around chasing ghosts and stuff. It all goes in waves. And I say, like right now, for instance, we're sort of in between waves. We have been since the pandemic, because I don't think since the Civil War our country there hasn't been this kind of divisiveness.
When you kind of look back in history, does the time now remind you of anything back in history paranormal wise?
It does kind of remind me of the years after, say, World War II, because there was a real lull in that period, which is odd because after the First World War, people were just sucked back into spiritualism and reincarnation. I mean, there's just tons and tons of material. It was front page news in the newspapers. There were seances going on. You had people like Harry Houdini, who's running around debunking fake mediums, and getting a thrill out of the attention that it got him, and, chasing people around. Scientific American magazine, which we think of as like this very dry, important thing. They were running a contest in the early 1920s to pay $10,000 to any spirit medium who could prove they could contact the dead. I mean, this was like on the news. I mean, this was every night kind of thing. And then after World War II, that all sort of changed. And maybe that had something to do with the fact that we just dropped a couple of atomic bombs, and the world was feeling really weird about things. And then people seemed to kind of focus away from spiritualism and ghosts and hauntings and things. And they started to look, say, into space, and now we're thinking, okay, we want something weird. It's going to have to come from somewhere else because we've already seen this place is terrible, and it stayed that way until probably the mid 60s or so, when things took kind of a darker turn and we got really interested in the occult, and not just the supernatural, the paranormal, but a lot of, black magic and things. I mean, and that all kind of played out in culture. You had Rosemary's Baby, you had the founding of the Church of Satan, big pop culture things. The Exorcist comes along, The Omen comes along. That was kind of a dark time in our history. And then it just keeps going back and forth. So this, where we're at right now, kind of makes me think about that period after World War II, because we're not really focusing on, ghosts and the paranormal as much at the moment, but it'll change again. And we always come back to the paranormal. We've been doing it since we were living in caves. We love things that are out there, in the night. It provides explanations for us, of what's happening.
I do think definitely like you can see it after the pandemic, after the political situations that we've been going to, not to get into that necessarily, but I can see us heading towards a period of stability where everybody just wants to no, I just want everything to be like the 1950s in that sense, that we just want everything to be nice and safe and good. And then we'll kind of go in the opposite direction of that after that.
Right. Yeah. It does make me wonder what's around the corner, because we did have that lull there for a while. And then society changed so much after that period, just culture and society with, music and, the hippie movement, all that kind of stuff. And then, things got really dark. By the end of the 60s, things got dark, and it kind of makes me wonder if we're planning on repeating that history or not. I guess we'll see. Hopefully not quite that extreme. I don't want us to end up in the 1980s again, when, people believed without any evidence whatsoever that, there were devil worshipers and permeating every corner of our country.
The ones when I kind of think of big moments, paranormal moments, so to speak, in U.S. history, I think of the Salem witch trials. I think of the Satanic Panic. Mm-hmm. Are there other big ones that you would say are out there that maybe people don't immediately know about?
it's a period we don't talk about much anyway. In the teens, the 19 teens. The only time we've talked about that was in 2020 when we were comparing it to the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic. Nobody was talking about what came with that, which was this huge resurgence in a belief in ghosts and hauntings and going to see psychics. I mean, that's why people like, Houdini ended up with a career, because most people could tell you he wasn't that great of a magician, but he was a great escape artist. And he also had this fascination with spiritualism. I mean, this was one of the biggest celebrities in the country. And he got other people interested in it too, because initially his idea was he wanted to find somebody who was legitimate that could put him in touch with his dead mother. And he went looking and couldn't find anybody. And he kept seeing, fake ones that were doing things he could imitate on stage. And then he became angry and decided to try and take down the whole movement. And so he started he wrote books about how to expose the fakes. He did stage shows and things. But the interest in it around the country is, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, this was front page news. You had wars of words between Houdini and prominent spiritualists of the day appearing in the front pages of newspapers. And our entire country was just wrapped up in this stuff. And this was right in the middle of Prohibition because, well, we needed a distraction. The Roaring Twenties were out there. Business was going good. Things were hopping, but you couldn't go buy a drink anywhere. And you had gangsters shooting each other in the street. So what's the opposite of that? Well, how about if I just go talk to my dead Aunt Gertrude at a seance down the street? And people were just enraptured with the whole idea. And it lasted until it lasted until the beginning of the Great Depression.
Do you think that we generally seem to be, are we more skeptics or more believers?
I think that people in general have become more skeptical, but I think this is something that people can let in a little bit of belief because it's fun, frankly.
Are you ready for some harder / listener submitted questions?
Sure, of course.
What are some of the most haunted places in America?
Places. I would say, on my list, I would put the Gettysburg battlefield near the top of my list. Actually, Gettysburg or Antietam. Both of them are well preserved, and that may have something to do with it. But, you're talking about places where thousands of people died in a 1 to 3 day period. And, there's been a lot of history left behind there. And based on the sheer number of reports over the years, I honestly think that they would rank way up there as one of the most haunted places. Another one I would say is the Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville, Kentucky. It's an abandoned tuberculosis hospital built back in the 30s. A lot of stories over it. I'm one of those guys who's a real stickler for making sure stories are accurate. I've been doing that for a long time. And while a lot of the stories are way out of control about how many people died there were still a lot. And it is a big, creepy, foreboding place. And it is the first place, well, probably the last place, at least that I know of, that I actually saw a ghost. I actually saw a ghost at Waverly Hills, and that convinced me, I guess there is something to all these stories, but it did frighten me. I'm not going to lie. I was startled by it because I was walking down a hallway with a friend of mine, no electricity in the building. It's dark, but there's enough light to see. And a man in what looked like a doctor's coat just walked across the hallway quickly ahead of us. Now, he looked so real that we thought someone had broken into the hospital. Because it's a real target for vandals and things. At least it was at the time. This was early 2000s. And so we went in to tell the guy he had to leave. And when we went into the room, he was gone. The room was empty, and there was no exit door other than the one we just come through. And that's when I realized I've seen a ghost. I've only ever seen one other one. Ever. If there's more than that, like I said, I don't know. But that definitely got my attention, and I would definitely say it's a very haunted place. The Limp Mansion in St. Louis, that's another one. And that was just owned by a family who were millionaires. They had started a beer brewing empire in St. Louis, which was famous for that. I mean, that's where like Anheuser-Busch is based out of. But the Limp family and their beer, no one's heard of anymore because they went out of business at the start of Prohibition. But But the Lemps were this German American family that you could kind of say were cursed. One of the sons died, followed by then the suicide of the patriarch of the family. Later, his oldest son committed suicide, and then one of the daughters committed suicide, and then another son committed suicide. 3 of them in that house. And so I've spent a lot of time there at that place over the years visiting, because it's always been pretty close. And yeah, it's by sheer number of reports, it's got a lot of them.
Do the haunted places, the most haunted places, do they seem to have something in common about them?
Yeah, I think every one of them, because I would also list places like Alcatraz or Eastern State Penitentiary, places like that too. All of them have a lot of tragedy and a lot of death associated with them, and it doesn't always have to be, oh, all these people died there. I honestly think that most hauntings, just, chronicling them the way that I have for 31 years now, I think that a lot of haunted places, it's really just history. It's just an impression of the things that have taken place there that have left an impression behind. I live in a town called Alton, Illinois, and it's known as one of the most haunted small towns in America, which is funny because back in the 1870s, Mark Twain called it a dismal little river town. And the two names go together, and the reason why it's the most haunted is because it was a dismal little river town. We had fires, we had epidemics, we had the Fair State Penitentiary in Illinois was here, turned into a Confederate prisoner camp during the war. There's just been a lot of things that have gone on here, and it's the same way with all of these places that I list as most haunted spots. And I honestly think that most hauntings, I'd say 90% of hauntings, are not what we would call ghosts. They're more like just some energy left behind. I always call them residual hauntings, sort of like a memory that leaves a recording on a place. And then for whatever reason, that recording will kick back off and replay itself. And people will hear footsteps, or they'll smell things, or they'll see a ghost. And it's not really a ghost. It's just an apparition of something that was there many, many years ago. To give you an easier example, the most haunted place in almost any supposedly haunted old house is normally the staircase. People always talk about ghosts going up down the stairs. They hear them, they see them on the stairs. I think the main reason for that is because back in the days when those homes were built, where were all the bedrooms? Second floor. So more people spent time on the staircase than probably anywhere else in the house, going up and down, expending energy, and now that energy just is hanging around. But then, I honestly do think that there are cases of, places that are haunted by what we would see ghosts like on TV, somebody's personality that stayed behind.
Yeah, I've always kind of looked at it like I'm personally skeptical. I personally haven't had experiences, but my thing is whether it's real or not, if you believe it's real, then it's real.
Absolutely. Yeah. They say 3 out of 5 Americans have had an experience with a ghost.
If it is so prevalent, though, right? Like we have all these places, we have so many people that, like you said, 3 out of 5. Why do you think there is such a skepticism about it? Such an external skepticism and an internal belief?
I think that a lot of people will have experiences that they're not positive about. Sometimes they'll tell them to someone else. Sometimes they won't. But if you don't want people to think you're crazy, you keep that stuff to yourself. But yet when someone asks you anonymously, well, do you believe in ghosts? Well, you're quick to say, well, yeah. I mean, as long as nobody knows it's me that's admitting to it. So I used to like to say that there are 2 kinds of people, those who believe in ghosts and those who just won't admit it. But I'm not sure it's quite that cut and dried. It just makes for a funny line. But I think that a lot of people have an interest in the possibility.
What is your personal favorite ghost story?
My favorite ghost story is Resurrection Mary. She is, just to give it to you in a nutshell, she is a ghost who haunts the southwest side of Chicago. There's a road called Archer Avenue, and there's a cemetery on it called Resurrection Cemetery. And for years, all the way back to the 1930s, people claim that they have picked her up and have given her a ride. She's a vanishing hitchhiker story. She disappears out of the car, often at the gates to the cemetery. Now, I always say, though, that this particular story is a little different than most of the vanishing hitchhiker stories because it's not a friend of a friend story. There are real names, real people, real places, and it's the only ghost that I know of, or at least that I can think of off the top of my head that actually left physical evidence behind, where she was observed, she was seen standing at the gates to the cemetery by a passing motorist, holding onto the bars, looking out. A young woman was, so we'll leave it at that. He went down to the police station just down the road, told them that there was a woman who had gotten locked into the cemetery by accident, probably. So the police went back to look. A cop named Pat Homa, as a matter of fact. So there are real names in the story. Went back to the cemetery. They couldn't find anybody. And then he shined his light over on the gates to the cemetery. And the bars, two of the bars where the girl had been standing, had actually been pulled apart, and there were you can see in the photograph, fingertips pressed into the metal where it was burned, because the bars were burned. It had been like a greenish color, like copper does, except now they had been burned out where it was. They were blackened, and you could see the fingerprints in there. But this story is so interesting because there are like a couple of different descriptions for the ghost. I mean, some people will say she's a blonde in a white dress. Other people say she has dark, kind of like shoulder bobbed hair, and it's dark, and she's wearing a kind of a light purplish colored dress. And why is there two stories? Well, the weird thing about it is I'm pretty sure that, and this is, again, one I've spent a lot of time working on the history and trying to research it. I think it's more than one woman who died, whose now ghost is being picked up along the road. One of the first ones was a woman named Marie gosh, I just lost everything. Her name was Marie Bregovi, and she was a Polish immigrant worker who lived not too far away, and she was killed in an auto accident. And in 1934, March 11th, 1934, she died, was buried in Resurrection Cemetery, and within like a week, the cemetery caretaker had called the guy who'd embalmed her and said, "I saw a ghost in the cemetery," and then went on to describe Marie to a T. And that wasn't the weirdest part. The weirdest part was not long after that, people started seeing a young girl with dark hair wearing an orchid, kind of a light colored dress, running out from the cemetery gates trying to flag down cars to get a ride on the road. And sometimes she would jump onto their running boards and try to climb in the window and stuff. Yeah, no kidding. And the weird thing about this was that the people who this was happening to recognized her as Marie Bergovi. They knew her because they all grew up in that same neighborhood, and they all used to go to the same place. There was a dance hall down the street called the O. Henry Ballroom, and it went on to become the Willowbrook, but they actually recognized her. And so they're like, okay, we're not going to drive by here anymore at night because we're seeing our dead friend in front of the cemetery. So that went on for a long time. And then there were the people who claimed that they had picked up this blonde. There was a guy whose name was Jerry Palis. He met a girl at a dance hall one night, blonde, spent some time with her. She asked if he could take her home. He drove her down Archer Avenue, and they got to the front of the cemetery, and she told him this is where she had to get out. Well, he thought she meant on the other side of the road, because off the road there were some apartment houses, and he offered to drive her the rest of the way, and she said, "No, where I'm going, you can't follow." Got out of the car, and instead of going toward the houses, she went across the street and disappeared when she got to the cemetery gates. This guy swore it happened. He swore he spent the entire evening with her. He was interviewed in the newspapers. He was on, I think, like Unsolved Mysteries, one of the TV shows from the early 90s. And he died in 92. And up until that time, he absolutely swore this really happened.
Does America have certain famous ghosts? Like, who are America's most famous ghosts?
I would put Abraham Lincoln on that list. I always say he's the most well-traveled ghost in American history because of all the places where he's supposed to haunt. From his tomb and where he was buried in Springfield, to his home in Springfield, to random places all over the country, places that he stopped at once, or places where, Abraham Lincoln slept here. Well, apparently now his ghost does too, because there's so many stories. Fort Monroe in Virginia, he stayed there a couple times during the Civil War. People claim they've seen his ghost. Ford's Theater, his ghost is supposed to haunt there, or the house across the street where he actually died. But if there's any place that he does haunt, we're back to the White House again, because it's Lincoln's ghost that everybody has seen. I mean, we're talking presidents, politicians, people who, gosh, Eisenhower, Teddy Roosevelt, Jackie Kennedy. I mean, there's just this long list of people. Truman always thought it was Lincoln that he heard walking around. Winston Churchill, in December of 41, spent the night at the White House, was there to meet with FDR. And he spent one night in the Lincoln bedroom, and the next day he asked to be moved to another room. He said that he was taking a bath, and he got out of the bathtub and was walking around the room naked looking for a towel. And he looked up, and Abraham Lincoln was standing in front of him. And Churchill claims he said to Lincoln, "Mr. President, I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage." And then Lincoln smiled at him and disappeared. Yeah. Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands spent the night in the White House. She was there to speak to Congress, but she stayed. FDR was kind of backing her for political asylum, and she'd stayed there during FDR's presidency. And the next night after her stay at a cocktail dinner, she told the president that she had fainted the night before. And the president asked her, what do you mean? And she said that at 2 o'clock in the morning, she'd heard a knock on her door, so she'd gotten up to answer it. And when she opened it, and she even said, "I know you're not going to believe this, but Abraham Lincoln was standing in the hallway." And she said, and after that, everything went black and I woke up on the floor. I mean, she had no idea that Lincoln had been this long-running ghost who'd been seen. So I put Lincoln pretty high on that list because they're talking about an all-American ghost. I mean, you can't ask for a bigger one than that. Probably the other one that I would say, though, would be the Bell Witch of Tennessee. It's one of those stories that we call it a witch, but it was really a ghost. That was the term they had for it in 1814 when this whole thing started. They were settlers. The Bell family were settlers to Tennessee. And for some reason, they were targeted by what they called a witch. And it was this ghost who just wreaked havoc in their house. I mean, tore the place apart, banged on walls, broke things, attacked John Bell, who was the patriarch of the family, and his daughter Elizabeth. The ghost would always go after her too. It would beat both of them, slap them, pinch them. And this would happen in front of dozens of witnesses. I mean, and there are affidavits still on file in Tennessee from people who claim that they saw it happen. And apparently Andrew Jackson himself got involved in this story because John Bell Jr., who was the oldest son, had served with him in the army in New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812. And so Jackson had heard about this ghost story that was going around at the time and came to visit. And he and his men were actually scared away by what was happening inside the house because of all the violence and activity. But what makes it cool is that it is the only ghost story in American history where the ghost took credit for killing someone, because John Bell died. He was poisoned. He became very sick because of the effect that this ghost was having on him. And at some point, he died one point during the night, and it was discovered that his medicine had been replaced by this black bottle that had something in it. They didn't know what it was. No one recognized it. The doctor said he didn't prescribe it. So they took some out and they gave some of it to a cat, which immediately died. So it's wherever this bottle came from, it poisoned John Bell. And supposedly the ghost, who could speak but nobody ever saw, they would hear its voice, took credit for killing John Bell. That farm is still around. The foundations of the house are still there. People still talk about the story because on that property was a cave that the family used to use for storing, perishable foods during the summertime. And the story is that when the ghost left the family, it went into the cave. So the Bell Witch Cave is another place I would put on the list as one of the most haunted places in America. Not so much, I'm not convinced that it's the Bell Witch that haunts it, but man, is it a weird place. Really weird. I spent the night there once in 1997. I'd never do it again. I mean, this kind of stuff doesn't really scare me. I mean, it's my job, but I spent the night in that cave, and I wouldn't stay there again. It was that freaky. I mean, all night long I kept hearing voices and people walking around. There was no one in there. I mean, it was empty with a locked gate on it. Nobody could have gotten in, and I don't know what was going on. But man, I've seen some weird photographs and things from there, and all kinds of weird stuff happens. And I don't know, it's just kind of an anomaly.
That's pretty much all the questions that we have. Is there kind of what's coming up next for you? I know you got a lot of books. I know you got the show, the museum.
Yep. Got a podcast. I've got a new book coming out in November about the history of American circuses and sideshows and some of the ghost stories that go along with that. But it's really just an excuse to get to write cool stuff about, sideshows and carnivals. But it's still got ghost stories with it too, and that's been a fun part of the project. But yeah, I'm actually doing a Houdini seance on Halloween night. Because Houdini always said that if it was possible to come back, he would.